Bain Capital Ventures Managing Director Matt Harris. So, Matt, before this quick break here, we were talking about Alibaba, then Alipay, and you gave me this great statistic that between Alipay and Tencent, they basically have 70% of market share for any e-commerce transaction in China.
Yeah, any online payment. It is huge, and it's justifiably disconcerting.
To the banks, anyway.
To the banks and the government that owns the banks.
Right.
And in China, you have to remember you're playing against the referee when you compete with the banks.
I like that. I have a guy in like black and white striped shirts. No, but you're right. That's fair enough.
So I don't think there's going to be any crackdown. I don't think there's existential risk to Alipay. But these limits on transaction size are meant to send a message, which is for little things, little purchases, little transfers, you guys can have that. But for big transactions, well, that's where you got to go through a bank.
Okay, so fair enough. So that is what's going on in e-payments in China.
Right.
What about the U.S.? Because you have spent a decade building your portfolio to shift to the way that we are all interacting with our money, and it's online.
Yep. And our thesis has always been that e-commerce moves way more quickly than in-store payments.
Sure.
And I think that's bearing itself out. I think Apple Pay.
Especially for Apple Pay, right?
Right. I mean, I am excited about Apple Pay. I use it to buy things in apps. And generally speaking, iPhone users do use it when they're making purchases in apps and increasingly in e-commerce.
Do you think if that's just because you're a techie and you know what you're doing? Because the overall numbers for Apple Pay and even the overall numbers for Apple Watch, what we seem to glean, are really not that impressive.
It's in the teens. And I agree, it's early adopters. You're essentially calling me a nerd, and that's okay.
Well,
I own it.
Kind, charming, smart, those are never bad things.
Fair enough.
But okay, so you're in there, you're using it.
And the early adopters are using it. They're just not using it in stores. That was always going to be the slowest thing to happen. Okay,
so you're just saying, listen, just because you haven't seen it, Deirdre Bolton, at the supermarket or wherever you're going, there's no need to judge Apple. I hear you, I'll back down. Now, what about Apple Pay with PayPal, this kind of partnership, which essentially is meant to benefit both?
Well, that's the thing we were waiting for. Between PayPal's announcement that their reader would accept Apple Pay and Rite Aid's announcement, even bigger. Rite Aid was one of the big holdouts from Apple Pay because they teamed up with Walmart for this competing currency, as it's called. Well, they announced this week that they've capitulated, and their stores will now take Apple Pay.
Okay,
so the dominoes are falling.
I was just going to say, even though the conversion has been slow, no less fervent, I have to ask you why you're here about Bitcoin, because and it gets back to this whole idea of volatility and people not exactly knowing. I mean, I think of this Monty Python sketch where you're like bringing like 3 chickens for, a goat. I mean, there is a lot of confusion, especially in international space as well. Does that mean Bitcoin is back?
We haven't been reduced to barter yet, thankfully, but I do. It's interesting when Greece looked like it was falling out of bed. Bitcoin price had been very stable around $230, $240 per Bitcoin, and it went up to $310 in the course of 2 or 3 days. It settled back down to $260, $270, and we saw another blip here in the past couple of days as China has been messing with its currency.
In Greece, which I understand is very much a cash economy, there was a barter system because at the ATMs, people couldn't take out more than 60 euro per day, and then they ran out of 10 euro bills, so it was 50 euro per day, and there were signs that kindly a friend translated for me, which really was back to the barter system.
That's right. And for a certain set of the population, they said that, this is a sign of the apocalypse. Give me some of that crazy digital internet money. And so, again, the price moved. But the trading range is still pretty bounded on Bitcoin. In fact, the latest news out of Bitcoin land is really this sort of growing conviction that the architecture behind Bitcoin, the blockchain, the way the transactions are settled, well, that can be useful for banks to settle real money, real world transactions. And there's some smart people working on it.
And I was just going to say, not for nothing, I mean, that's PayPal essentially started. I know the co-founders talk a lot about, they were trying to find a different measure, a different currency, and ended up with PayPal. It is great to see you, Matt Harris. Early adopter, Matt Harris, joining me there from Bain Capital Ventures.